walked into Clarence House carrying a folder. That detail matters more than anything that comes next in this story. The folder held floor plans, staff rosters, the finalized layout of her permanent apartments at Windsor Castle. Queen Camilla had been waiting on this meeting for months. Her diary listed it as a signature appointment, a formality, the kind of thing that gets scheduled, signed, and filed away before anyone has a second cup of tea. Her private secretary was already seated when she arrived. The document in front of him was not the floor plans. A sealed decree written by Prince Philip, held in archive, activated years after his death, had just stripped Queen Camilla of every permanent right inside every principal crown residence in Britain: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Sandringham, all four, gone before she had even taken her coat off. The man who executed it was not a lawyer or a courtier. He was not an institutional body with centuries of precedent behind it. It was William. What happened inside that room goes far deeper than the headline, and the detail that changes everything is still coming. Because this decree did not begin with lawyers or with palaces. It began with a single word spoken at a private dinner, and that one word cost Camilla 4 houses. He began to read. The decree had been written by Prince Philip, sealed, held in an archive, and activated not on the day he died, not during the transition of the crown, but this month inside this room, at a table Camilla had chosen to furnish herself. 4 residences named in sequence: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Sandringham, each one placed in careful legal language permanently beyond her reach, not beyond her access. That distinction is where the cruelty lives. She would have full access, but no real belonging. She could walk into any of those 4 buildings tomorrow. She could attend. She could stay when duty required it. She could stand on a balcony in front of a crowd and wave to a country that had spent 30 years slowly, reluctantly learning to accept her. None of that was taken. What was taken was possession. No permanent apartment, no household of her own inside those walls. She had no authority over who worked there or who slept where. She could not stop rooms being quietly reassigned when the calendar shifted. Full access, zero belonging. In 4 houses she had spent 50 years trying to enter. The secretary's voice faltered halfway through a page. Camilla told him to continue. Sit with that for a moment. A man reading her own destruction out loud lost his nerve, and she made him finish it. She did not take the document away from him. She did not clear the room. She sat composed and made a member of her household read every remaining line aloud to her. Every line tightened the same noose. Charles was sitting across the table. At some point during the reading, he reached for the papers. The gesture looked like a man trying to slow whatever was happening, so it stayed a paper issue, not a permanent change in the room. Camilla pulled them toward herself instead. Then she asked him the question he had been dreading since the secretary started reading. She asked how long his father had been planning this. Charles said nothing. Here is the detail that should stop you, because it stopped everyone in that room. He did not look surprised. He did not ask where the decree had come from. He did not question the language, or challenge the scope, or reach for something to write on. He straightened the document on the table rather than looking at his wife. A man who has just learned something unexpected does not straighten a document. A man who already knows reaches for something to do with his hands. Camilla turned to the last page. At the bottom, beneath the formal operative clauses, she found a handwritten instruction from Philip. No future royal marriage, it said, could automatically grant control over residences preserved for the sovereign for the direct line of succession or for national ceremonial duty. Notice the tone of that sentence. There is no anger in it, no bitterness in the phrasing, no personal jab. It is the kind of line a man writes after he has stopped being upset about something and started engineering around it. Philip had moved past emotion into architecture, and architecture is colder than anger and lasts considerably longer. Then the secretary noticed something wrong with the briefing file. The page numbering skipped. A page was missing, not lost, but missing, with the sequence jumping deliberately over it. He looked up. He said nothing. But the gap was there, and everyone in the room could count. Someone had kept a page back from the copy in front of the Queen, and the story had just become something else entirely. The secretary did not announce it. He simply stopped, looked down at the broken sequence and the silence. Did everything the missing pages already had. Camilla asked who had access to the withheld section. 3 names: Charles, Princess Anne, Prince William. Look at that list again. The man she is married to, the woman who was about to walk through that door, and the young man she had watched grow up inside this family, the one she had spent years carefully trying to reach across all the distance that Diana's memory had placed between them. Every person she might have turned to in that room, every person who might have warned her. All 3 had read something she had not. She had arrived believing this meeting was about floor plans. She was sitting inside a document about her own future, and there was a section of it her husband had already seen and chosen not to mention. She demanded the missing page immediately. The door opened before anyone answered her. Anne came in without knocking. She did not pause at the threshold or wait to be acknowledged. She walked directly to the table, placed a black archival case on its surface, and rested one hand on the lid, not opening it, just resting there. Consider the choreography, because none of it was accidental. She had not knocked. She had not waited to be summoned. She arrived at the exact moment the missing page was demanded, which means she had been close enough to hear the demand and had been prepared for this entrance for some time. The room reorganized itself around her the way rooms do when someone enters who has already decided how the next several minutes are going to unfold. Camilla told her the decree would be overturned. Anne did not argue. She did not raise her voice or shift the case or change her expression. She said that Philip had expected those exact words, and that he had prepared for them. Sit with what that actually means. Camilla had just made the obvious threat the first move any determined woman in her position would make, and the answer delivered without a flicker of hesitation by a woman who had been carrying this assignment quietly for years was that the threat had been anticipated, not recently. Not patched together after Philip's death when someone spotted a gap, before, while he was still alive, while Camilla was still building toward the coronation she would eventually receive. Philip had already heard this argument in his head, written the counter to it, sealed it, and died in the knowledge that one day someone would stand in exactly this room and say exactly what Camilla had just said. The defeat in that moment was not legal. It was architectural. 50 years. That is the investment Camilla had made inside this family. She had been booed in car parks for it. She was described as the most disliked woman in the country for 3 decades. She never said so publicly. That was a discipline most people could not sustain for a fortnight. She had absorbed every wave of it and shown up anyway until the country arrived at a reluctant peace with her. She had stood in Westminster Abbey in May 2023 with a crown on her head. She believed with the full conviction of someone who had paid that much that she had reached the other side. An old man who had been dead for 2 years had already written that she had not. The hand on the lid of the archival case had not moved. Camilla looked at her husband. He was looking at the table. She asked Anne to open the case. Anne said there was something Camilla needed to understand first, about where this had started, about the specific evening and the specific word that had set everything in motion. It was not a palace lawyer who had said it. It was Camilla herself. The story did not begin with lawyers. It did not begin with constitutional advisors or formal succession reviews or careful meetings between senior courtiers about what the next reign might look like. It began at a dinner table, a private dinner. Windsor, after a succession planning meeting that had run long and left everyone slightly too tired to be careful with their words. By that point, Philip had largely made his peace with Camilla. He had written letters to Charles in the early years, calling the affair foolish, had skipped the civil ceremony in 2005, had needed time to separate the woman from the damage the situation had caused, but he had moved through it, transferred his role as Colonel-in-Chief of the Rifles to her in 2020, attended Charles's birthday celebration held in her honor. Peace made in the way a man of his generation made peace through presence rather than declaration. What he had never made peace with was something more specific. At that dinner, a proposal came up. Reserved residential space at Windsor for William, Catherine, and the children. Apartments set aside and protected so the next generation's household would be established before the reign changed and the scramble for rooms began. In practical terms, this was the kind of domestic administration that keeps institutions running, the sort of thing that looks like paperwork from the outside and is actually the machinery of power from the inside. Camilla pushed back. Her argument was not unreasonable on its surface. She said these decisions should be made later, once Charles had actually taken the throne. That premature reservation created unnecessary tension, that the next sovereign's household should settle its own arrangements in its own time. Then she used a word. She described the protected rooms as unnecessary territory being claimed before the new reign had begun. Philip put his glass down. He asked her in a voice everyone present later described as completely level. He asked whether she considered the direct heirs' guests inside their own inheritance. The restraint made it worse. Every person at that table said the same thing afterwards, that if he had raised his voice, it would have been easier to absorb. He did not raise his voice. He asked a quiet question and waited. The waiting simply made the room go still around it. Camilla answered that Charles had already sacrificed enough and should not arrive at the throne surrounded by conditions written by the previous generation. Catherine said nothing. She moved her chair back slightly from the table, not dramatically, not enough to be noticed by someone watching casually. A small physical withdrawal from the word territory, from the framing of her children's future inside their own home as a claim being staked too early. That was the full extent of her contribution to that evening. One quiet movement of a chair. Philip saw it. He also saw William glance at his wife and then look down at the table. William was unwilling to turn a family dinner into a confrontation between his father's future and his own children's security. A small movement, the kind that passes in under a second and leaves nothing on the surface of a conversation. It left something on Philip. He had watched a woman lose her standing inside these buildings before. He had watched it happen across years through decisions made in rooms she was not in by people who told themselves they were protecting the institution the whole time. He was not theorizing about what happens when a consort's ambitions move ahead of the succession. He had lived through the worst version of it and stood at the funeral afterwards. He was not going to watch it happen to Catherine. Before midnight, he summoned his secretary and dictated the first clause. One apartment, one protected space, a single restriction around one set of rooms. But that was not where it ended. Because the following morning, he sat down with his son. And Charles, genuinely meaning to defend the woman he loved, said the one thing that turned a single room into 4 palaces. The conversation happened the following morning. No advisors present, no notes being taken, no institutional scaffolding around it. Just Philip and Charles, a father and a son who had been having versions of the same argument for 30 years and had learned across all of it exactly which words the other one heard clearly and which ones slid past. Philip asked Charles directly if Camilla ever pushed for greater residential control, would he protect William's household? It was not a threat dressed as a question. It was the kind of question a man asks when he already suspects the answer and needs to hear it confirmed before deciding what to do next. Charles answered that once he was king, he could not allow old family fears to govern his marriage. He was entitled to say that. It is a defensible position from a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades being told who he could and could not love, who had watched his private life become a public referendum, who had buried the argument in 2005 at Windsor Guildhall and spent 18 years after that watching his wife earn every inch of public acceptance she eventually received. He was not being careless. He was being honest about the kind of king he intended to be once he finally held the authority to decide. Philip did not hear a defensible position. He heard his son telling him in advance that the protections would not hold. Not through malice. Philip understood Charles too well to fear that. The danger was never bad intention. The danger was devotion. Charles would not dismantle the protections deliberately. He would do it gradually, generously, one reasonable exception at a time, because the woman he loved asked him to, and because each individual concession would appear small enough to justify. Philip had watched enough history to know that institutions are not destroyed by bad people. They are worn down by affectionate ones. Before the morning ended, he extended the restriction to every principal crown residence. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Sandringham, all four. What had started the previous night as a single protective clause around one apartment had become, in the space of one conversation, a structure covering the entire landscape of Crown residential life. One sentence from Charles, spoken not in weakness, but in love, is what widened this from a single room into an empire of residences. Philip wrote it all down, sealed it, put it in an archive. And then he died at Windsor Castle, 99 years old, without ever saying a word of it to Camilla's face. But there's something the reporting on this has missed. When you look carefully at the four residences named in that decree, two of them present a problem that changes the entire question of who really built this thing. Philip had no legal authority whatsoever over two of those houses. He knew it better than anyone. That meant somebody else had to complete what he started. Look at the four buildings carefully. The list is doing something nobody in the coverage has stopped long enough to examine. Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle are held by the sovereign in right of the crown. That phrase carries a specific legal meaning. The monarch holds them not as personal property, but as a permanent national asset, as custodian, not owner. Charles cannot sell them, cannot mortgage them, cannot leave them to anyone in a will, cannot hand a permanent apartment inside either of them to his wife on his own private authority. The constitutional law was already there before Philip wrote a single word. For those two residences, the decree was reinforcing something the architecture of the state had already established. Balmoral and Sandringham are an entirely different matter. Prince Albert purchased Balmoral in 1852. Queen Victoria purchased Sandringham in 1862 for her son. Both have passed down as the monarch's genuinely personal property, the way a house moves between generations in an ordinary family. Charles inherited them from his mother. He owns them in the plain sense. He can sell them. He can renovate them. He can decide on his own authority who sleeps in which room and whose name goes on which door. Philip had no standing over those two houses. None. He was never the sovereign. He never held them. He knew precisely what a sealed decree written by a duke could and could not legally compel. The clauses covering Balmoral and Sandringham only function if somebody currently alive chose to honor them as binding. There is exactly one person who could have made that choice. Charles did not simply fail to challenge the decree. He did not find himself outmaneuvered or legally cornered. He read what his father had written, including the two clauses covering houses he personally owns, and he agreed to be bound by them. He ratified the half of it that Philip could never have enforced on his own, quietly, before any of this ever reached a table at Clarence House, before his wife walked in that morning carrying her folder of floor plans. Then he sat across from her and let her ask him how long his father had been planning it. That is not a man who was trapped. That is a man who made a decision and then sat in the same room while the person he loves worked out what it meant. The reason is not complicated, though it is not comfortable. Charles has been at the center of exactly this argument once before. He stood between two women, and the country decided he had chosen wrong. In September 1997, it stood in the road outside this institution and made that judgment plain, while his sons walked ahead of him behind their mother's coffin. He came out of that with one lesson learned more thoroughly than any other. When this family lets a private dispute about a woman become a public dispute about the succession, the family loses. The country does not forget, and the cost is not paid by the institution, it is paid by the children. So he agreed to his father's terms in private, not because Philip could compel him, but because he had already decided he would not spend his reign fighting his father's last instruction in public with his marriage as the reason. He protected the institution. He left his wife standing in the open. Both of those things are permanently true. In the room at Clarence House, only one of them sat across the table from Camilla. She was the one who had to work out what the other one had meant. Camilla demanded the missing page. Anne opened the archival case. Before Anne lifted the sealed sheet, Camilla had already found an opening in the decree. In the decree's formal legal language, the lines she'd been rereading since the secretary's voice broke, there was a single small word. A single word in one subordinate clause that sat slightly looser than everything around it. An ambiguity. the kind a careful legal reading could work with, the kind a determined woman with the right advisors might be able to pull apart over time. She looked up. For one moment, the room felt different. Not resolved. Nothing in that room was close to resolved, but possible. Like a door that had appeared in a wall, everyone had been treating as solid. She'd been navigating public institutions long enough to know they aren't defeated by direct confrontation. They are negotiated one careful argument at a time by people with the patience to find the precise language that gives a structure permission to bend. She had found the language. Anne closed her hand around the sealed sheet and placed it on the table. The first hidden clause addressed the ambiguity directly, every word of it. The subordinate clause, Camilla had just identified the specific reading she had begun to construct, the legal angle that had felt 10 seconds earlier like a way through all of it, anticipated, all of it foreclosed, all of it locked inside a page that had been deliberately kept from her until this exact moment. Philip had not simply written a decree. He had read it the way an opponent reads it, searching every weakness, every loose phrase, every opening where a skilled argument might find footing, and he had closed each one before he signed his name. He had written it and then stress-tested it and then sealed it. But the first clause was not the trap. It was the door standing in front of the trap. What came underneath was the trap itself. Any attempt to pressure the sovereign into overriding the decree would automatically trigger a stronger set of restrictions. Then work through what it does to every instrument Camilla possesses. She cannot ask Charles for help. Asking makes her position worse. She cannot persuade him in private. Persuading makes it worse. She cannot work on him the way she has always worked on him, through patience, through intimacy, through the quiet accumulation of private moments that has been the actual foundation of their relationship across 50 years. That is her greatest skill. It is the reason she is queen. It is the instrument she has used more than any other to navigate this family. And the second page turned it into the one thing she cannot deploy without detonating everything else. Philip had studied the way Camilla moved through Charles's life and the way Charles moved around her. He had identified precisely how influence operated between them, and he had made that specific mechanism her greatest strength, the thing the trap was built to catch. The second clause went further still. No renovations, no household appointments, no decisions about the allocation of private space inside any of the 4 residences without written consent from the named guardians. These are not ceremonial powers. Who works in a building, who sleeps near the sovereign, whose staff occupies which corridor. That is how real influence gets constructed inside an institution like this one. Not through titles or public appearances, through proximity, through access, through the invisible patient work of being present in the right places long enough. The decree did not only say where Camilla could not live, it said how much she was permitted to matter when nobody was watching. Anne named herself as the primary guardian. She had accepted the role before her father died, knowing what it would eventually require of her. She had been carrying it quietly ever since. Then she turned the page. William's name was underneath hers. His countersignature was required. Without it, Camilla could not be granted even one permanent private suite inside any of the 4 houses. Charles looked at his son across the room and understood the position immediately. He had been built into the mechanism itself, and there is a difference between those two things that changes everything about what was about to happen. Camilla turned to the supporting schedule looking for weakness. Another loose phrase, another ambiguity Philip had missed in the later sections. She had found one before. Documents this long written across multiple sessions sometimes carry inconsistencies where the early precision does not reach. She was patient, she was methodical, and she was not finished. She found Catherine's name instead. Not once, not as a passing reference inside a single clause, repeatedly, across multiple sections of the schedule in language that grew more specific with each appearance. The pattern wasn't deniable once she had seen it. This decree had not been written only to close one door. It had been written with equal deliberateness and equal care to open another, to lock a second woman's future permanently in before anyone was positioned to argue about it, before the reign had changed, before Catherine herself had the standing to request any of it. Philip had built her position inside a legal instrument, sealed it, died, and waited for someone to open the envelope. The written instruction was precise. Catherine must never depend on a previous consort for access to the homes where she may one day serve beside the sovereign. Camilla's name was nowhere in that sentence. It did not need to be. Leaving it out was the colder choice because a sentence with a name in it can be disputed. A sentence describing a category cannot. And there was only one person in that category. Everyone in the room knew it without being told. Beneath the instruction sat something else entirely. A dormant succession schedule, a prepared arrangement inactive, triggered automatically by a specific condition. The condition, the moment William assumed expanded constitutional duties. The consequence, immediate residential priority for Catherine at Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. Apartments, staff access, household space. All of it pre-established, pre-documented, requiring neither the Queen's agreement nor her awareness to activate. Philip had not simply protected Catherine's future, he had automated it. He had set the mechanism before he died, and aimed it at a moment that had not yet arrived. It was arranged to fire on its own, without requiring anyone to make a decision that could be pressured, delayed, or quietly negotiated away by a man who loved his wife too much to hold firm. Camilla understood the silence in the room before anyone said a word. She was not looking at a document that excluded her. She was looking at a blueprint for her own replacement, drawn up in precise detail by a man dead 4 years, already aimed, already moving, pointed at a constitutional moment drawing closer with every month that passed. Then Charles returned from the smaller room where he had read Philip's personal letter alone. He placed the letter on the table without speaking. His face carried something that was not grief and not anger. It was the particular expression of a man who has just had an argument he has been conducting with himself for years, resolved from the outside in writing by someone no longer available to be answered. Philip had written that his son's devotion to Camilla might compromise his judgment in matters touching the succession. He had not written that he disapproved of her. He had written that he did not trust Charles to choose correctly between his wife and the crown, and had taken steps accordingly. Read it as a father speaking to a son meant to be opened after death. He is saying in permanent ink that the central decision of Charles's adult life, the choice he had defended for 30 years, the one that cost him more than any other, could not safely be left in the hands of the man who made it. Charles had spent 30 years insisting that love and duty could coexist. His father's last written words said those two things could never safely occupy the same hands, and then built a legal structure on that assumption and sealed it in an archive. Camilla looked at her husband across the table. He did not look back. Then the door opened. Charles walked in from the corridor, and the first thing he did, the direction he moved, the person he looked toward, was noticed by every person in that room, including Camilla. Charles did not go to his wife. The room was not large. The distance between the door and where Camilla was sitting was not large, either. A few steps across a floor he had crossed 1,000 times in that building. He had walked into rooms and gone directly to her for 30 years. In public, in private, in rooms far more hostile than this one, surrounded by people far less willing to be sympathetic. He stood still. Camilla saw it before she registered anything else. After 50 years, she knew the language of his body more precisely than anyone alive, knew the difference between a man gathering himself and a man who has already arrived somewhere and is simply waiting for the room to recognize it. She had read him across ballrooms and state dinners and private arguments that never made it into any public record. She read him now in under a second across a few feet of carpet and understood what his stillness meant before he opened his mouth. He had already made his choice. He had come in not to intervene, but to be present for what came next. And the first person his eyes moved toward when he finally looked across the room was not his wife. It was his son. Camilla pushed the papers away from her. She told them they were using a dead man's authority to humiliate her, that Philip could not be questioned, could not be reasoned with, could not be held accountable for anything that happened in this room or any other room ever again, that arguing against a sealed decree from a man 4 years in the ground was not a legal process. It was a performance of obedience to someone who had constructed things specifically so he would never have to defend them in person. It was the strongest argument she made in the entire morning. Everyone present acknowledged it afterward. She turned to William first. She told him that refusing an exception would punish Charles more than it punished her, that the king would spend what remained of his reign watching his wife treated as a visitor inside his own houses, that a man who had already sacrificed more than any sovereign in living memory deserved better than to grow old inside an institution that had written a legal boundary between him and the woman he chose. She had moved past her own injury and placed his father's dignity on the table instead. It was precisely aimed. William is the one person in that room who might have moved for it. He held her eye. He told her that his father's pain could not become permission to dismantle protections built for people not yet born. Quiet, certain, landing in the room like a door closing from the inside. He was not rejecting her out of dislike. Every account of that morning describes a man who looked genuinely ill, who was not enjoying a single moment of what was unfolding. But he had a conversation with his grandfather, held in his memory a recorded private exchange, in which Philip had told him that temporary feeling must never be allowed to reshape permanent inheritance. He was watching that exact sentence demonstrated in real time in front of him. His reasoning was structural, not sentimental, and not cruel. If one marriage could alter protected residential rights, every future succession becomes a private negotiation. Every incoming consort arrives and begins asking. Every heir spends the early years of their reign defending rooms instead of doing the work the rooms were built to support. But William had a second reason, one he did not state aloud because he did not need to. His mother had spent the last years of her life inside this institution without a defined place in it. Her standing had been decided by other people in rooms she was not in. Years of small decisions, each seeming manageable, had together taken everything. William had been old enough to watch it happen, old enough to understand what an unprotected position looked like from the inside, not as a principle, but as a daily experience for a woman he loved. He was not going to let his wife find out how that felt. Anne had said nothing through all of it. She watched. Then Camilla turned to her and said that Philip had never understood the modern monarchy. Anne moved her chair closer to the table. She said her father had understood it well enough to predict every person currently sitting in this room, every argument they would each make, every pressure Charles would eventually come under, every move Camilla would attempt first. Her voice never rose. It never does. And that is precisely what makes her the most formidable person in that family when she decides to be not the volume, but the accuracy. The arguments in the room had been exhausted. The consequences had not. The first consequence did not arrive in a courtroom. It arrived at a door, a ring of keys on a polished table. No announcement, no ceremony, no one reading anything aloud or remaining in the room to observe the reaction. Someone from the household set them down and left without meeting her eyes. The door closed behind them, with the particular quietness of a door closed by someone who has been told not to make a sound doing it. She had spent her adult life reading the small signals inside that building. Keys returned to a table without explanation communicated more than any prepared statement could have. The rooms at Windsor prepared for her would not become her household. Her staff would be leaving. Her renovation plans ended where they were. Every future stay inside that building would require someone else's approval, someone else's calendar-written consent from a list of names that did not include her own. She kept the title. She kept the ceremonial role. She kept the public standing that 30 years of relentless, uncommented-upon endurance had built for her one engagement at a time. She lost the certainty of belonging. Those two things are not the same. She understood the gap between them better than anyone in that building. She had spent enough years holding one without the other to know exactly what that distance felt like from the inside. Then a household official entered the study and removed her planning folder from the desk. He did it correctly, with the careful neutrality of someone executing an instruction they did not write and want no part of. The folder held room assignments, staff arrangements, renovation notes accumulated across months. She had already begun to inhabit that future in her mind, not vaguely or as a hope. She pictured it in the specific, layered detail of a woman who had finally let herself believe it was settled. She told him to leave. He left. The door closed. Then she was alone. Her hand gripped the back of a chair hard enough for the staff outside to hear it move across the floor, and Camilla cried. She had survived scandal. Survived being the most disliked woman in the country for 3 decades without complaining about it publicly once. She had outlasted all of it. She had stood in Westminster Abbey in May 2023 with a crown on her head and believed the argument was finally finished. This one was different. Not because it was louder, because it was quieter, because it came from inside the family from a man who could not be confronted, and because it reached into the ordinary daily places, the rooms, the keys, the folder, where a life actually gets lived rather than performed. Then Catherine asked to see her, alone. No William, no Anne, no Charles. The two of them in a room with the door shut by Catherine herself, a gesture that meant something specific in a building where doors are almost always closed by someone else. Catherine went back to the dinner first. She said she remembered that evening clearly. When the reserved apartments were described as unnecessary territory, something settled in her. She had a quiet understanding that her children's place inside their inheritance might one day depend on someone's private goodwill rather than on anything established. She had moved her chair back. She had said nothing. She had let the evening end. She told Camilla what Philip had said to her privately afterward, that she and William and the children would never be made to feel like temporary occupants inside the institution they were expected to inherit. Not a reprimand. A guarantee from an old man to a young woman who had just watched her family's future described as a territorial claim. Then Catherine offered something. A permanent private sanctuary. One of Charles's personally owned properties, properly staffed, completely beyond the reach of Philip's decree and the 2 guardians enforcing it. A place with Camilla's name on the door that no dormant schedule could reach, that required no countersignature, that belonged to a man who had already made his choice and had the authority to make it stick. She would never hold Windsor, never hold Buckingham Palace or Balmoral or Sandringham, but she would have a home no sealed archive could touch. Camilla did not forgive the decree. She did not pretend the morning had not happened. But she stopped demanding that Catherine surrender the protections. And she agreed to help draft a statement that would keep what had happened inside that building from becoming a public war. Outside the gates, the country had already found the story, and it had reduced itself the way these things always do to a single image that said everything the palace had not. A queen standing outside the houses of the crown she represents, not removed, not publicly diminished in any way a camera could capture. Standing outside, correctly dressed, performing every duty asked of her, and holding nothing behind those walls that belonged to her when the day ended. Philip's supporters called it foresight. His critics called it cruelty in legal clothing. Both readings came from the same set of facts, which is why neither side could land a clean blow. The country worked out the distinction between a house the king personally owns and a house held for the monarchy faster than anyone inside those gates expected. Presenters were explaining crown property law on daytime television, because the actual question underneath all of it was one anyone could answer. Whether marrying someone should be enough to give you a permanent claim on what they inherited inside an institution built specifically to outlive every person in it. Photographs appeared at the railings outside Buckingham Palace, Philip in uniform, Catherine with her children. One woman placed them there and said to no one in particular that he had been protecting what was coming next. The last time photographs gathered at those railings in any number was 1997. The message then was that this family had failed a woman it should have protected. 29 years later, the crowd came back and left a picture of the man who wrote the rules and said thank you. Camilla read the official palace statement alone before releasing it. One sentence defended her years of service. She removed it. In its place, she wrote a single line, committing herself to respect the arrangements, protecting future generations. A small edit, the entire truth lives inside it. She kept the injury and surrendered the counterattack, which is the hardest kind of discipline, the kind that looks like nothing from the outside and costs everything from the inside. Charles established their principal private home at a property under his own personal control, not crown property. not governed by guardians or dormant schedules or countersignatures from anyone, a place where his marriage did not depend on another person's pen. It was not what she wanted. It was a place where nobody got to decide whether she belonged. After 50 years of having that question answered by other people in rooms she was not in, that was no small thing. It is not 4 palaces, but it is permanent. And permanence was what this whole story was always actually about underneath the sealed pages and the archival cases and the legal language that made it look like something else. Camilla returned the final Windsor key herself. She did not wait for someone to collect it, did not send a member of her staff, did not leave it somewhere to be found later. She carried it back with her own hand and set it down, the last decision in this entire story that remained entirely hers to make. She made that choice deliberately and without being asked. William gave her one assurance before it was over. The decree would never be used to diminish her public dignity, weaken her ceremonial role, or turn the institution against her. She gave one in return. She would not challenge the residential protections built around Catherine and the children. The arrangement has held since. Now look at what Philip actually built. One dinner, one-word territory spoken at a Windsor table by a woman who had no idea it would cost her everything she was still moving toward. A dictated clause before midnight. A private conversation with his son that expanded one protected room into 4 palaces before dawn. 2 guardians named because their reputations could not be pressured. A trap wired into the second page aimed precisely at the move he knew she would try first. A dormant schedule set to fire on its own years after his death without requiring any decision that affection could soften. Then he sealed it, put it in an archive, and waited. Camilla spent 50 years getting into those rooms. She married Charles at Windsor Guildhall in 2005 with half the country hostile. She showed up the morning after and kept showing up. She stood in Westminster Abbey in May 2023 and believed that was the end of the argument. An old man who had been dead 2 years had already written down that it was not. He never had to say it to her face. And in the end, the only door in Britain with her name permanently on it is one her husband had to buy her, because every door that belongs to the crown belongs to the institution first. The institution was here before she arrived. It will be here long after the argument about her is forgotten. She got a house. She wanted 4. And the distance between those 2 things is the whole story.